They called her the Broken One, so she was left behind while 17 girls were sold like cattle to desperate men across the frontier. But one Lakota warrior saw what others refused to see, and his fierce protection would transform a scarred woman into the most beautiful force the Wyoming Territory had ever known. Cheyenne Station, Wyoming Territory, October 1876. The wind carried the stench of unwashed bodies, tobacco spit, and desperation across the makeshift auction platform, where 18 young women stood in a ragged line like merchandise waiting to be appraised. The autumn sun beat down mercilessly on the crude wooden stage that had been hastily constructed behind Murphy's saloon.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Mail-order brides, they called them, though the reality was far uglier than the polite term suggested. These were women with nowhere else to go, sold by families who couldn't feed them, collected by unscrupulous traders who promised new lives, but delivered only new forms of bondage. The crowd of potential buyers pressed closer, their eyes calculating as they examined each woman, like they might inspect a horse's teeth before purchase. 17 girls stood with varying degrees of resignation and terror etched across their faces. There was Mary, barely 16, with golden hair that caught the light like spun wheat. Catherine, 19, with porcelain skin, had never known hard labor. Agnes, 22, with the kind of curves that made men's voices catch in their throats. One by one, the auctioneer called out their supposed virtues like he was selling livestock at market day. But at the far end of the line, almost hidden, in the shadow cast by the platform's rough-hewn support beam, stood Scarlett Dalton. 20 years old, with auburn hair that refused to be tamed and a left arm that hung withered and useless at her side, twisted from a difficult birth that had nearly killed both mother and child. The men's eyes passed over her like she was invisible, their gazes sliding away the moment they noticed the deformity that made her worthless in their estimation. The auctioneer, a greasy man named Cornelius Weeks who traded in human misery, with the same casual indifference he might show selling grain, didn't even bother to call out Scarlett's attributes. There weren't any worth mentioning, not in a world where a woman's value was measured solely by her ability to bear healthy children and perform household labor without complaint. Her withered arm made her damaged goods, a broken tool that no sensible man would purchase. The bidding began with the efficiency of practiced cruelty. Mary went first, her youth and beauty sparking a fierce competition between a cattle rancher from Montana and a mining foreman who had struck silver in the Black Hills. The numbers climbed higher and higher until the rancher's $150 won the day, and Mary was led away with tears streaming down her face but her chin held high. Catherine followed, then Agnes, then the others in descending order of perceived desirability. Each sale was accompanied by the transfer of coin, the signing of crude contracts, and the loading of human cargo into wagons that would carry these women to fates they could only imagine. Some buyers seemed kind enough, others were cruelty-like, a badge of honor, but all shared the same fundamental belief that women were property to be owned rather than people to be cherished. As the afternoon wore on and the crowd thinned, Scarlett remained on the platform like a piece of furniture. Someone had forgotten to move. The other women cast sympathetic glances her way, but what could they do? They were powerless themselves, bought and paid for, their own destinies now in the hands of strangers who saw them as investments rather than individuals. Weeks grew increasingly agitated as the day progressed, and his most difficult merchandise remained unsold. He had promised his suppliers that all 18 women would find buyers, and Scarlett's continued presence on his platform represented a loss of profit and reputation. He tried half-hearted attempts to drum up interest, calling out her supposed virtues in increasingly desperate tones. Strong back for farm work, he lied, knowing her arm made heavy labor impossible. Good breeding hips, he added, though her medical history suggested childbirth would be complicated at best. Quiet temperament, he concluded, mistaking her stubborn silence for docility, rather than recognizing it as the fierce pride of a woman who refused to beg for acceptance from those who had already deemed her worthless. But the remaining men in the crowd weren't fooled by weak salesmanship. They could see what he was trying to hide, and none were desperate enough to pay good money for damaged merchandise. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that matched Scarlett's hair, it became clear that she would be the only woman returning to Weeks' wagon unsold. The final indignity came when Weeks, frustrated beyond measure and facing the prospect of feeding and housing an unsold woman for another week, made an announcement that would haunt Scarlett for months to come. Standing on his makeshift platform with his voice carrying across the nearly empty lot, he declared that anyone willing to take the crippled woman off his hands could have her for the price of his transportation costs back to Denver. $20. That was what Scarlett Dalton was worth to the world, less than the cost of a decent horse or a month's supply of coffee and beans. The few remaining men chuckled at Weeks' desperation, but even at such a bargain price, no one stepped forward to claim their prize. $20 was still $20. And why spend good money on a woman who could barely work when you could wait for the next shipment and perhaps find better merchandise? The laughter from the crowd cut deeper than any physical wound Scarlett had ever endured. These men weren't just rejecting her. They were ridiculing the very idea that anyone would want her at any price. She stood there in the fading light, her good hand clenched into a fist at her side, her withered arm a constant reminder of her supposed inadequacy, feeling the weight of every cruel word and dismissive glance. But Scarlett Dalton had not survived 20 years in a world that saw her as broken, without developing an iron core of determination that even this ultimate humiliation could not shatter. She had learned long ago that tears were a luxury she couldn't afford, that showing weakness only invited more cruelty from those who mistook kindness for vulnerability. So she stood there and endured, her green eyes blazing with a fury that none of these small-minded men could understand or appreciate. As the crowd began to disperse and Weeks started the process of dismantling his auction platform, Scarlett found herself alone for the first time since being loaded onto the trader's wagon 3 weeks earlier. The other women were gone, carried away to whatever futures awaited them, leaving behind only the memory of shared suffering and the faint hope that some of them might find happiness despite the circumstances of their arrival. The silence that followed the departure of the last wagon was deafening in its completeness. Even the usual sounds of frontier life seemed muted, as if the very air was holding its breath in sympathy for the woman who had been deemed too flawed for even the desperate men of the Wyoming Territory. Scarlett looked around at the empty lot, littered with the debris of shattered dreams and broken promises, and wondered what would become of her now. What Scarlett didn't know was that the entire proceedings had been observed by someone who saw the auction through entirely different eyes. Hanska Blackfeather had been watching from the shadows cast by the trading post's loading dock, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the degrading spectacle with a mixture of disgust and growing anger that burned like a fire in his chest. Hanska was Lakota, though his current circumstances made him an exile from his people, just as surely as Scarlett had been exiled from any hope of acceptance in white society. At 28, he possessed the lean strength of a man who had lived by his wits and skills in a world that viewed his very existence as a threat to be eliminated or a resource to be exploited. His long black hair was braided with strips of leather and adorned with feathers that spoke of honors earned in battle, and his weathered face bore the kind of scars that came from surviving when others did not. He had come to Cheyenne Station not for the auction, but to collect payment for guiding a wagon train safely through Crow territory, a job that required him to navigate between the competing hostilities of white settlers who feared him and tribal
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Warriors who viewed him as a traitor for working with their enemies. It was a lonely existence that suited a man who had learned that belonging anywhere was less important than surviving everywhere. But something about the red-haired woman's stubborn dignity in the face of such casual cruelty had captured his attention and refused to let go. He had seen many injustices in his 28 years, had witnessed the systematic destruction of his people's way of life and the casual brutality with which the white world treated anyone who didn't fit their narrow definitions of acceptable. Yet there was something about this particular woman's situation that resonated with his own experience of being judged and found wanting by societies that could not see past surface differences. Hanska understood what it meant to be unwanted, to be seen as broken or dangerous simply because you didn't match the expectations of those in power. He had been born into a world where his mixed heritage made him suspect among both whites and Indians, where his father's Scottish blood was visible enough in his features to mark him as different among his mother's people, while his Lakota upbringing made him forever foreign in the eyes of white society. As he watched Scarlett endure the final humiliation of Weeks' $20 offer, Hanska felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't pity, which would have been an insult to her obvious strength, but rather a recognition of kindred spirit. Someone else who had learned to stand alone in a world that seemed determined to break anyone who dared to be different. The decision, when it came, surprised him with its suddenness and clarity. Hanska had survived this long by avoiding unnecessary entanglements, by keeping his emotions carefully controlled and his commitments limited to those that served his immediate needs. But watching this woman face rejection with such fierce pride awakened something in him that had been dormant too long, a need to act not for profit or survival, but simply because it was right. As Weeks began packing up his remaining supplies, and Scarlett stood alone on the abandoned platform like a forgotten piece of cargo, Hanska emerged from the shadows with the silent grace that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. His moccasined feet made no sound on the hard-packed earth as he approached the platform, but something in his presence caused both Weeks and Scarlett to turn toward him with expressions of surprise and wariness. The traitor's hand moved instinctively toward the pistol at his belt when he saw the tall Indian approaching, but Hanska's own weapons remained untouched at his sides. He wore 2 Colt revolvers in well-worn holsters, a bone-handled knife that had belonged to his grandfather, and a Winchester rifle slung across his back, but his posture conveyed no immediate threat. Instead, he moved with the careful neutrality of a man who understood that his very appearance could provoke violence from those who saw all Indians as enemies. "You said $20, Hanska stated in English that carried only the faintest trace of accent, his voice pitched low and steady. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Weeks' eyes narrowed as he tried to process this unexpected development. In all his years of trading in human misery, he had never had an Indian attempt to purchase one of his women, and the implications of such a transaction made him distinctly uncomfortable. Scarlett's reaction was more complex, a mixture of shock, confusion, and something that might have been hope if she had allowed herself such a dangerous luxury. She studied Hanska's face, trying to read his intentions in features that white society had taught her to fear, but which showed none of the crude hunger or casual cruelty she had seen in the eyes of the men who had rejected her. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like understanding, as if this stranger somehow knew exactly what it felt like to be judged and found wanting. Weeks recovered from his surprise quickly, his merchant's instincts overriding his racial prejudices. When faced with the prospect of finally ridding himself of his unsold merchandise, "You got $20, Indian?" he asked, his tone skeptical but not entirely dismissive. "And what exactly do you plan to do with a white woman, especially one that ain't exactly prime breeding stock?" the casual cruelty of the traders. Words caused Scarlet to flinch despite her best efforts to remain impassive, but Hanska's expression never changed. He reached into the leather pouch at his belt and counted out 20 silver dollars, placing them on the platform's rough wooden surface one by one with deliberate precision. The sound of metal striking wood rang out like a bell in the evening air, each coin representing a piece of Hanska's carefully hoarded resources, being spent on an impulse he didn't fully understand. "What I do with her is not your concern," Hanska replied, his voice carrying an edge that made Weeks take an unconscious step backward. "You want the money or not?" The transaction that followed was conducted with the same businesslike efficiency that had characterized all the day's sales, but the atmosphere was charged with an undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with commerce and everything to do with the complex web of racial animosity and social taboos that governed frontier society. Weeks drew up a crude bill of sale that transferred ownership of Scarlet Dalton to Hanska Blackfeather, though both men understood that such a document would have no legal standing in any court that might choose to examine it. As the papers were signed and the money changed hands, Scarlet found herself studying the man who had just purchased her like she was a piece of livestock. Hanska stood nearly 6 feet tall with the lean, muscular build of a man who lived an active outdoor life, his copper-toned skin bearing the weathered look of someone who spent his days under the sun and wind. His clothing was a mixture of Indian and white styles, buckskin pants and shirt adorned with beadwork that spoke of his heritage, but with boots and a gun belt that marked his adaptation to frontier realities. But it was his eyes that captured her attention and held it, dark brown, depths that seemed to see far more than they revealed. There was intelligence there and strength, but also a kind of loneliness that she recognized because it mirrored her own. This was a man who understood what it meant to exist on the margins of society, who had learned to survive in a world that offered no easy place for someone like him. When the business was concluded and Weeks had loaded his wagon for the journey back to Denver, Hanska turned his attention to Scarlet for the first time since the transaction began. She stood on the platform still, uncertain whether she was expected to climb down or wait for instructions, her good hand clutching the small bundle that contained all her worldly possessions while her withered arm hung at her side like a constant reminder of her inadequacy. "You can come down now," Hanska said, his voice gentler than she had expected. "Unless you prefer to spend the night on a wooden platform." The question, asked with what might have been humor, broke through some of the tension that had held Scarlet frozen since this unexpected turn of events began. She climbed down from the platform with careful dignity, favoring her left side to compensate for her arm's weakness, and found herself standing face to face with the man who had just spent $20 to purchase her from a human trafficker. "I suppose I should thank you," Scarlet said, her voice hoarse from hours of silence, but steady despite the uncertainty of her situation. "Though I'm not entirely sure what you've saved me from or what you've saved me for." Hanska studied her face in the gathering dusk, noting the proud tilt of her chin and the defiant spark in her green eyes that all the day's humiliation had been unable to extinguish. Here was a woman who had been broken by circumstances, but not defeated by them, who possessed the kind of inner strength that he had learned to recognize and respect during his years of surviving in hostile territory. "My name is Hanska Blackfeather," he said formally, offering her a slight nod that managed to convey respect without condescension. "And I think we should start by getting you something to eat and a safe place to sleep. Tomorrow we can discuss what comes next." As they walked away from the abandoned auction site toward the dim lights of Cheyenne Station's main street, neither Scarlet nor Hanska could have imagined that this moment would mark the beginning of a transformation that would change not just their own lives, but the entire balance of power in a territory where survival depended on understanding the difference between those who saw others as human beings and those who saw them only as tools to be used and discarded. The first chapter of their story was ending, but the real adventure was just Beginning, the main street of Cheyenne Station stretched before them like a gauntlet of curious stares and whispered conversations, each step drawing more attention than Scarlett had ever wanted in her life. Word traveled fast in frontier towns, and the sight of a Lakota warrior walking alongside the woman no white man had deemed worth purchasing created a spectacle that pulled people from saloons, shops, and boarding houses to witness this unprecedented breach of social order. Hanska moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for signs of trouble while maintaining an outward appearance of calm indifference. He had learned long ago that showing fear or uncertainty in hostile territory was an invitation for violence, and the hostile glares following their progress made it clear that his presence with Scarlett was being interpreted as something far more threatening than a simple business transaction. Scarlett kept pace beside him despite the awkwardness her withered arm created in her gait, refusing to show weakness in front of the growing crowd of onlookers. She had endured public humiliation earlier that day, but this felt different, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with her perceived flaws and everything to do with the man walking beside her. The whispers that followed in their wake carried words like squaw and savage, terms that revealed the ugly assumptions being made about their relationship. The Frontier House Hotel loomed ahead of them, a two-story wooden structure that represented the height of luxury in Cheyenne Station, but which Scarlett suspected would not welcome their unconventional pairing. She had been in enough frontier towns to understand the unwritten rules that governed such places, the invisible barriers that separated acceptable customers from those deemed undesirable by polite society. "We need to talk," Hanska said quietly as they approached the hotel's front steps, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. But not here. Too many ears, too many eyes looking for trouble. Instead of entering the hotel, he guided her toward a narrow alley that ran between the building and Murphy's Saloon, where the sounds of raucous laughter and off-key piano music provided cover for private conversation. The space was dimly lit and smelled of garbage and horse waste, but it offered something more valuable than comfort: privacy from the prying eyes and hostile intentions of Cheyenne Station citizens. In the shadowy space between buildings, Hanska turned to face Scarlett directly for the first time since their transaction had been completed, and she found herself studying his features with an intensity that would have been considered improper under normal circumstances. But nothing about this day had been normal, and the usual rules of social interaction seemed inadequate for navigating the strange territory they now found themselves occupying. "I need you to understand something," Hanska began, his voice carrying a weight that suggested the importance of whatever he was about to say. "What happened back there, what I did, it wasn't charity. I don't make a habit of rescuing people, and I'm not looking for gratitude or anything else you might think you owe me." Scarlett felt a flicker of something that might have been disappointment, though she couldn't quite identify why his disclaimer bothered her. Had she really expected this stranger to be motivated by kindness towards someone he had just met? Then why? She asked, surprised by the directness of her own question. Why spend $20 on someone you don't know and don't want? Hanska was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face as if trying to decide how much truth she could handle. When he finally spoke, his words carried a honesty that cut through the careful politeness she had expected. "Because I know what it's like to be the one nobody wants. And because watching those men treat you like damaged goods made me angry. In ways I haven't felt for a long time." The admission hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, and Scarlett found herself taking her first real look at the man who had intervened in her life with such unexpected consequences. She saw now what she had missed in the shock of the moment, the careful way he held himself apart from the world, the guardedness in his posture that spoke of someone who had learned not to expect acceptance from those around him. "What did you mean when you said you know what it's like?" she asked, though part of her suspected she already understood. In a territory where racial tensions ran as deep as mineral veins through rock, A man with Hanska's heritage would face rejection and suspicion wherever he went, regardless of his personal qualities or accomplishments. My father was Scottish, Hanska said, answering her unspoken question with characteristic directness. Came west as a fur trader and fell in love with my mother, who was Lakota. Neither of their peoples approved of the match, and their son has spent his life being too white for the reservation and too Indian for the settlements. Scarlett felt a shock of recognition at his words, understanding suddenly why his intervention had felt different from the crude interest of the men at the auction. This was someone who knew exactly what it meant to exist in the spaces between acceptance, who had learned to navigate a world that offered no comfortable place for those who didn't fit its narrow categories. So what happens now? She asked, surprised by her own boldness in pressing for details about her uncertain future. You've bought me according to the law, but we both know that piece of paper Weeks wrote doesn't mean anything real. What do you actually want from me? Hanska's response came after another long pause, and when he spoke, his words carried a complexity that revealed how much thought he had already given to this question. I want you to have a choice, he said finally. Something you didn't have on that platform today. I know a place where you can work and earn your own money, where people will judge you by what you can do rather than what you can't. It's not easy work, and it's not a life that most women would choose, but it's honest and it's free. The place Hanska described was unlike anything Scarlett had imagined when she first climbed aboard Weeks' wagon 3 weeks earlier with dreams of finding a new life in the territories. Fort Laramie lay 2 days' ride to the north, a military outpost that served as a crucial link in the chain of communication and supply that connected the scattered settlements of Wyoming Territory to the civilized world beyond. The fort needs interpreters, Hanska explained, his voice taking on a practical tone as he outlined the opportunity he was offering. People who can speak multiple languages and help negotiate between the army, the local tribes, and the civilian population. It's dangerous work sometimes, and it requires someone who can think quickly and isn't afraid of difficult situations. Scarlett felt a stirring of something she hadn't experienced in years. Genuine interest in a future that didn't involve scrubbing floors or bearing children for a man who saw her only as a convenience. What makes you think I could do work like that? She asked, though her tone suggested curiosity rather than skepticism. Because you've survived everything life has thrown at you so far, Hanska replied with a certainty that surprised her. And because I watched you stand on that platform today and refuse to break even when they were treating you like garbage. That kind of strength doesn't come from an easy life. It comes from learning to adapt and overcome when the world tells you that you don't belong. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps and raised voices from the main street, and Hanska's hand moved instinctively toward his pistol as he peered around the edge of the building to assess the potential threat. What he saw made his expression tighten with concern. A group of men from the auction were making their way toward the hotel, their movements suggesting they had been drinking and talking themselves into something foolish. We need to leave, Hanska said urgently, his military bearing suddenly much more apparent as he shifted into what Scarlett recognized as a combat mindset. Now, before they work up the courage to do something we'll all regret. But Scarlett surprised him by not moving immediately toward whatever escape route he had in mind. Instead, she stepped slightly forward, positioning herself where she could see the approaching men while remaining partially concealed by the building's shadow. How many? She asked, her voice steady despite the danger their situation represented. 6, Hanska replied, noting with approval that she was asking tactical questions rather than panicking. Too many to fight without someone getting hurt. Not enough to make them think twice about starting trouble. There's another way, Scarlett said, her mind working quickly through options that didn't involve violence or retreat. Something they won't expect because they think they know what kind of woman I am. Before Hanska could ask what she meant, Scarlet stepped out of the alley and directly into the path of the approaching men, her chin raised with the same defiant pride she had shown on the auction platform. The sudden appearance of their intended target caught the group off guard, and they stumbled to a halt just a few feet away from her, clearly having expected to find her cowering somewhere rather than confronting them directly. "Gentlemen," Scarlet said, her voice carrying a tone of mock politeness that somehow managed to sound more dangerous than any threat. "I understand you have some concerns about my recent change in circumstances. Perhaps we should discuss them like civilized people rather than skulking around in the dark like common thieves." The leader of the group, a heavy-set man named Clayton Morse who owned a struggling ranch east of town, had clearly been elected spokesperson by virtue of his slightly higher social standing and marginally better sobriety. He swayed slightly as he tried to focus on Scarlet's face, his eyes showing the kind of confused anger that came from too much whiskey and too little thinking. "Now see here, Missy," Morse slurred, his words carrying the belligerent tone of a man who felt his authority being challenged. "We got concerns about what's happening here. Ain't natural, a white woman taking up with a savage. Folks are gonna talk, and that kind of talk brings trouble to decent communities." Scarlet's response came with a speed and sharpness that caught everyone, including Hanska, completely off guard. "Mr. Morse," she said, her voice cutting through his bluster like a blade through cloth, "I believe you're the gentleman who owns the property with the diseased cattle that you've been trying to sell to the army without mentioning their condition. Curious how quickly your concern for community standards appears when it's convenient for you." The accuracy of her observation hit Morse like a physical blow, and the other men in his group exchanged uncertain glances as they realized that this woman they had dismissed as broken merchandise possessed information that could cause them serious problems. Scarlet had learned during her years of moving between frontier communities that survival often depended on paying attention to details that others overlooked, and her memory for useful facts had saved her more than once. "You don't know what you're talking about," Morse blustered, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "And even if you did, ain't nobody gonna take the word of a crippled woman over a respected businessman." "Perhaps not," Scarlet agreed with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "But I imagine Captain Morrison at Fort Laramie would be very interested to learn about the cattle disease outbreak you've been concealing, especially since his men have been eating beef from your herd for the past 2 weeks. Military tribunals have such interesting ways of dealing with contractors who endanger the health of federal troops." The threat was delivered with such casual precision that it took several seconds for its full implications to sink in among Morse's companions. When understanding finally dawned, the men began backing away from their leader, clearly unwilling to associate themselves with someone whose criminal activities had just been exposed by the woman they had come to intimidate. Hanska watched this verbal destruction unfold with growing admiration for Scarlet's tactical instincts and her ruthless efficiency in neutralizing the threat without resorting to violence. This was not the broken, helpless woman that Weeks had been unable to sell, but a formidable opponent who understood exactly how to use information as a weapon more devastating than any gun. "Now then," Scarlet continued, her tone becoming almost conversational as she pressed her advantage, "I believe we were discussing community standards. It seems to me that a man who profits from poisoning soldiers while preaching about moral behavior might want to reconsider his position before someone decides to examine his activities more closely." The confrontation ended not with violence, but with Morse and his companions retreating toward the saloon with as much dignity as they could salvage from their humiliating defeat. As they disappeared into the building's smoky interior, Scarlet turned back toward the alley where Hanska waited, her expression showing no trace of the satisfaction she must have felt at turning the table so completely on her would-be tormentors. "Where did you learn to do that?" Hanska asked as they resumed their interrupted journey toward whatever destination he had in mind for the night. His voice carried a respect that hadn't been there before. The recognition of someone who had just witnessed a masterful display of strategic thinking under pressure. "From watching people," Scarlett replied with characteristic directness. "When you're the one everyone overlooks, you see things they don't think you're smart enough to understand. Information is power, and power is survival when you don't have anything else." As they walked through the now quiet streets of Cheyenne Station toward an uncertain but suddenly much more promising future, Hanska found himself revising his initial assessment of the woman he had purchased on impulse. Scarlett Dalton was not damaged goods or a charity case requiring his protection. She was a survivor with skills and intelligence that complemented his own. Someone who might prove to be not just an ally but an equal partner in whatever challenges lay ahead. The transaction that had begun as an act of angry compassion was evolving into something far more complex and potentially valuable, though neither of them yet understood just how dramatically their lives were about to change. The pre-dawn air carried the bite of approaching winter as Scarlett emerged from the cramped storage room behind Chun's general store where Hanska had arranged for her to spend the night. The Chinese merchant had asked no questions when the Lakota warrior appeared at his back door with $20 and a request for discretion, understanding that some transactions in frontier towns were better conducted away from prying eyes. And wagging tongues, Hanska waited in the alley with 2 horses, his own paint stallion and a sturdy bay mare that looked capable of handling the rough terrain between Cheyenne Station and Fort Laramie. The animals stood quietly in the morning mist, their breath visible in small clouds that dissipated quickly in the crisp air. Scarlett had never owned a horse, had rarely even ridden one, but she approached the mare with determination rather than fear. "Her name is Sage," Hanska said as he watched Scarlett run her good hand along the horse's neck, noting the natural ease with which she interacted with the animal despite her obvious inexperience. She belonged to a cavalry officer's wife until a Cheyenne raid left her widowed and heading back east on the next stage. "Sage is gentle but smart, and she'll carry you safely if you trust her judgment." The morning routine of preparing for travel revealed new aspects of both their characters as they worked together to secure supplies and adjust stirrups for Scarlett's shorter legs. Hanska moved with the efficient precision of someone who had spent years living rough, every motion economical and purposeful. Scarlett compensated for her physical limitations with careful planning and stubborn persistence, refusing to ask for help with tasks she could accomplish despite her withered arm. "Fort Laramie is 2 days hard riding," Hanska explained as he checked the cinch on Scarlett's saddle one final time. "We'll follow the North Platte River most of the way, staying close to water and avoiding the high passes where early snow might trap us. There are way stations where we can rest the horses, but we'll be camping rough tonight." Scarlett nodded her understanding, though privately she wondered how she would manage tasks like building fires and preparing meals with only one functional arm. She had learned to adapt to her limitations over the years, but frontier camping would present challenges she had never faced before. The thought of proving inadequate to Hanska's expectations created a knot of anxiety in her stomach that she fought to suppress. As they prepared to leave Cheyenne Station behind, neither of them noticed a figure watching from the second story window of Murphy's saloon, where Clayton Moore stood with a bottle of whiskey and a head full of angry thoughts about the previous night's humiliation. The rancher's bloodshot eyes followed their progress with the intensity of a man planning revenge, his fingers drumming against the window frame as he calculated distances and opportunities. The first hours of their journey passed in relative silence as both riders adjusted to the rhythm of long-distance travel and the awkwardness of being alone together in the vast Wyoming landscape. The trail followed the North Platte River through rolling hills covered with buffalo grass and sagebrush, the horizon stretching endlessly in all directions under a sky so blue it seemed to go on forever. Scarlett's inexperience with extended riding became apparent within the first few miles. Her posture stiff and uncertain as she fought to maintain her balance while compensating for her arm's weakness. Hanska watched her struggle without comment for nearly an hour before finally calling a halt beside a small creek where cottonwood trees provided shelter from the wind. "You're fighting the horse," he observed as Scarlet dismounted awkwardly, her legs already beginning to protest the unaccustomed exercise. "Sage knows what she's doing. Your job is to move with her, not against her." What followed was Scarlet's first lesson in frontier horsemanship, conducted with a patience that surprised her given Hanska's typically efficient approach to most tasks. He showed her how to shift her weight in harmony with the mare's movements, how to use her legs and her good arm to maintain balance without gripping the reins too tightly, how to trust the animal's instincts rather than trying to control every aspect of their progress. In Lakota culture, Hanska explained as he adjusted her stirrups to better accommodate her physical limitations, "We believe that horses are sacred beings who choose to carry us rather than being forced to serve. When you approach riding as a partnership instead of a conquest, the horse will take care of you." The lesson extended beyond mere technique as Hanska began sharing aspects of his heritage that most white settlers never had the opportunity to learn. He spoke of the spiritual connection between rider and mount, the way Plains tribes viewed horses not as property, but as family members whose welfare was as important as that of their human companions. For Scarlet, who had spent her life being treated as property herself, these concepts opened new ways of thinking about relationships and respect. As they resumed their journey with Scarlet riding more comfortably, Hanska began pointing out details of the landscape that revealed his deep knowledge of the territory they were crossing. He identified edible plants, showed her how to read weather signs and cloud formations, explained the significance of animal tracks they encountered along the trail. Each lesson was delivered without condescension, as if he genuinely believed she was capable of learning and remembering information that might prove crucial to her survival. "Why are you teaching me all this?" Scarlet asked during a brief rest stop, genuinely curious about his motivations. "Surely an interpreter's job doesn't require knowing which berries are safe to eat or how to predict storms from the way grass moves in the wind." Hanska was quiet for a moment, considering how to explain something that was more instinct than conscious decision. "Because knowledge is the difference between being helpless and being free," he said finally. "And because I've spent too many years watching people be destroyed by their ignorance of the world around them." As the afternoon sun climbed higher and the miles stretched behind them, the conversation between the unlikely traveling companions began to delve into more personal territory. Scarlet found herself sharing details of her life that she had never spoken aloud, perhaps because the vast landscape around them seemed to invite honesty in a way that enclosed spaces never had. "I wasn't born like this," she said suddenly, gesturing toward her withered arm with a matter-of-factness that spoke of years spent explaining her condition to curious strangers. "The midwife who delivered me was drunk, and when I came out wrong, she tried to fix the problem by pulling too hard. Tore something that never healed properly." The casual brutality of her origin story hung in the air between them, and Hanska felt a familiar anger at the careless cruelty that seemed to pervade so much of human interaction. He had seen too many lives damaged by the thoughtless actions of those who held power over the vulnerable, had experienced firsthand how society discarded anyone who didn't meet its arbitrary standards of perfection. "My mother died when I was 12, Hanska offered in return, his voice carrying the careful control of someone sharing a pain that had never fully healed. Not from disease or accident, but from heartbreak. She never stopped loving my father, even after his people convinced him that marrying a squaw would destroy his chances of success in the white world." The parallel experiences of abandonment and rejection created a bond between them that went deeper than mere sympathy, a recognition that they had both survived wounds that went far beyond the physical. As their horses picked their way through a particularly rocky section of trail, Scarlet found herself studying Hanska's profile. and wondering what other scars he carried beneath his stoic exterior. "Is that why you left your tribe?" she asked, emboldened by his willingness to share painful memories. "Because of what happened with your parents?" Hanska's expression darkened, and for a moment, Scarlet thought she had pushed too far into territory he wasn't ready to explore. When he finally answered, his words carried a weight that suggested depths of conflict she could barely imagine. "I left because I refused to participate in a war that would accomplish nothing except getting more of my people killed. The tribal council called me a coward. My own brother said I had become too much like the white man to understand honor." The admission revealed the true cost of Hanska's exile from his people, the price he had paid for following his conscience, rather than tribal expectations. Scarlet understood now why he had seemed so familiar with the pain of rejection, why he had recognized something worth saving in a woman no one else wanted. They were both refugees from societies that had cast them out for refusing to conform to impossible standards. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats from behind them, and Hanska's military training took over. As he guided them toward a cluster of boulders that would provide cover if the approaching riders proved hostile. The landscape that had seemed so peaceful moments before now revealed its potential for ambush, and Scarlet felt her heart rate increase as she realized how vulnerable they were on the open trail. "How many?" she asked, surprised by her own calm as she followed Hanska's lead in taking defensive positions among the rocks. The lessons in survival he had been teaching her throughout the day suddenly took on urgent practical importance. "3 riders," Hanska replied, his hand resting on his rifle as he studied the distant figures through a gap in the boulders. "Moving fast, following our trail. Could be innocent travelers, but innocent travelers don't usually push their horses that hard unless they're running from something or chasing it." As the riders drew closer, Hanska's suspicions proved justified when he recognized the lead horse as belonging to Clayton Morse, the rancher whose criminal activities Scarlet had exposed the previous evening. The man's persistence in pursuing them across difficult terrain suggested that his wounded pride had overcome his better judgment, always a dangerous combination in men who solved problems with violence rather than intelligence. "Morse," Hanska said grimly, confirming Scarlet's worst fears about their pursuer's intentions. "And 2 others I don't recognize. Probably hired guns from the saloon. Men with nothing to lose and everything to gain from making trouble for people like us." The tactical situation was not favorable for a direct confrontation, as their position among the boulders provided good cover, but no escape route if the approaching riders decided to surround them. Hanska's mind raced through options, calculating distances and angles while trying to determine whether Morse was stupid enough to attempt violence against a woman and a man who had already demonstrated their ability to defend themselves. "What does he want?" Scarlet asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Men like Morse didn't forgive public humiliation easily, and the combination of wounded pride and alcohol had driven more than one frontier dispute to its bloody conclusion. 2. Prove that nobody makes a fool of Clayton Morse without paying the price, Hanska replied, his voice carrying the weary tone of someone who had seen this pattern play out too many times before. Men like him measure their worth by their ability to hurt those they perceive as weaker. And last night you showed everyone in Cheyenne Station that he's not as powerful as he pretends to be. The approaching riders slowed as they spotted the abandoned horses near the boulder field, and Morse's voice carried across the distance as he called out challenges that were clearly intended to provoke a response. His words were slurred, with drink and thick with the kind of crude threats that revealed more about his character than any formal introduction could have managed. "Come out here, you red devil," Morse shouted, his voice echoing off the rocks around them. "You and that crippled whore you're protecting. Nobody asked you to interfere in white men's business, and it's time you learned some respect for your betters." Scarlet felt a familiar rage building in her chest at the casual cruelty of Morse's words, but more than anger, she felt a cold calculation that surprised her with its intensity. This man represented everything she had learned to hate about a world that measured human worth by arbitrary standards, and she found herself wanting to teach him a lesson he would never forget. "I have an idea," she whispered to Hanska, her voice carrying a confidence that made him turn toward her with surprise. "But it requires you to trust me, and it might get dangerous before it gets better." Hanska studied her face, seeing something there that reminded him of a warrior preparing for battle. Whatever Scarlet was planning, it clearly involved more than simply hiding until their pursuers gave up and went home. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his willingness to follow her lead a testament to the respect she had earned during their brief partnership. "Create a distraction," Scarlet replied, already moving toward a position that would give her a clear view of the approaching riders. "Something that will get their attention focused on you long enough for me to even the odds." What followed was a display of tactical coordination that would have impressed seasoned military officers, as Scarlet used her knowledge of human nature and Hanska's skills as a warrior to turn their desperate situation into an opportunity for decisive action. The plan she had conceived was audacious in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness, proving once again that underestimating either of them was a mistake that carried serious consequences. Hanska emerged from cover with his hands raised, appearing to surrender to Morse's demands while actually positioning himself to draw the three riders into a carefully prepared trap. His apparent capitulation convinced the rancher that victory was within reach, causing him to make the kind of tactical errors that experienced fighters learn to exploit without mercy. "That's better," Morse called out triumphantly, urging his horse forward while his companions spread out to flank their supposedly defeated opponents. "Now we're gonna have ourselves a little conversation about respect and consequences, starting with what happens to Indians who forget their place in the natural order." But Morse's moment of triumph was short-lived, as Scarlet's carefully planned intervention turned his advantage into a nightmare of confusion and pain that left him wondering how a crippled woman and a single Indian had managed to defeat three armed men in open combat. The details of that confrontation would become legend in the saloons and trading posts of Wyoming Territory, though the truth was far more complex than the stories that eventually emerged as the dust settled and their defeated pursuers limped back toward Cheyenne Station with wounds to both body and pride. Scarlet and Hanska found themselves looking at each other with new understanding and mutual respect. The partnership that had begun as a business transaction had evolved into something far more valuable, an alliance between equals who understood that survival in hostile territory required both individual strength and absolute trust in one's companions. The trail to Fort Laramie stretched ahead of them, but the journey had already accomplished something neither had expected when they left Cheyenne Station that morning. They had discovered that together they were far more formidable than either could have been alone, a realization that would prove crucial as they faced the greater challenges that awaited them at their destination. Fort Laramie rose from the Wyoming plains like a monument to military ambition and manifest destiny. Its wooden palisades and stone buildings arranged in perfect, geometric order that spoke of discipline imposed upon the chaotic wilderness. The American flag snapped in the constant wind above the parade ground, while uniformed soldiers moved through their daily routines with the mechanical precision of men who understood that survival in hostile territory depended on absolute adherence to regulations and chain of command. But beneath the surface order lay currents of tension that even casual observers could detect in the nervous glances exchanged between sentries and the way conversations stopped abruptly when officers approached. The fort existed at the intersection of multiple conflicts between settlers and native tribes, between military authority and civilian interests, between the federal government's promises and its actual capabilities in controlling territory. Larger than most eastern states, Scarlet studied the fortress with the analytical eye she had developed during years of reading people and situations for signs of hidden danger. The soldiers she could see appeared well-equipped and disciplined, but their faces carried the strain of men operating under constant pressure from threats they couldn't always identify or predict. This was not a peaceful posting where career officers came to advance through routine administration. This was a combat zone where survival required constant vigilance. Hanska's reaction to the military installation was more complex, his expression revealing layers of emotion that ranged from professional respect for the fort's defensive capabilities to deeper feelings about what the structure represented in terms of his people's diminishing sovereignty. He had worked with the army before, had even served as a scout during particularly dangerous operations, but approaching Fort Laramie always reminded him of the fundamental contradiction in his position as a bridge between two worlds at war. "Captain Morrison commands here," Hanska explained as they approached the main gate, where armed guards waited with the practiced alertness of soldiers who had learned not to assume that any visitor was friendly. "He's a good man, fair in his dealings and smart enough to understand that making enemies of everyone will eventually get his people killed. But he answers to Washington, and Washington doesn't always understand the realities of frontier warfare." The checkpoint procedure that followed their arrival demonstrated both the military's attention to security and its awkward relationship with civilians who didn't fit standard categories. Hanska's reputation as a reliable scout gained them entry, but Scarlett's presence created complications that required explanations and paperwork that revealed how unprepared the army was for situations that fell outside normal protocols. "State your business with the fort," demanded Sergeant Kelly, a weathered Irish veteran whose accent still carried traces of County Cork despite decades in American service. His eyes lingered on Scarlett's withered arm with the professional assessment of a soldier, evaluating potential threats and weaknesses in everyone he encountered. "Miss Dalton is here to interview for interpreter positions," Hanska replied, with the calm authority of someone accustomed to navigating military bureaucracy. "She speaks several languages and has experience in diplomatic situations that require cultural sensitivity." Colonel James Morrison's office reflected the dual nature of his position, as both military commander and civilian administrator. With maps of tribal territories sharing wall space with correspondence from territorial governors and Washington, bureaucrats who had never seen the landscape they governed from 2,000 miles away. The man himself embodied the contradictions of frontier military service, a West Point graduate with enough combat experience to understand the limitations of textbook strategy when applied to unconventional warfare. Morrison's initial reaction to Scarlett's presence in his office revealed the complex calculations that frontier commanders made when balancing military necessity against social conventions that often had little relevance to actual survival requirements. He studied her with the analytical attention of an officer, assessing a potential asset while clearly struggling with the implications of employing a woman in roles traditionally reserved for men. "Mr. Blackfeather speaks highly of your abilities," Morrison said carefully, his tone suggesting that he was choosing his words with diplomatic precision. "But I must be frank about the challenges facing anyone who works as an interpreter in current circumstances. The situation with local tribes has deteriorated significantly since the Custer disaster at Little Bighorn, and tensions are running higher than I've seen in 15 years of frontier service." The reference to Custer's defeat hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, its implications clear to everyone in the room. The Army's confidence had been shattered by that catastrophic battle, and the political pressure for revenge had created an atmosphere where any association with Indian affairs carried risks that extended far beyond the immediate dangers of frontier life. Scarlett's response demonstrated the quick intelligence that had impressed Hanska during their journey, as she addressed Morrison's concerns with a directness that cut through diplomatic pleasantries to focus on practical realities. "Colonel, I understand that my appearance and circumstances might seem unconventional," she began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned to advocate for herself in hostile environments. "But unconventional problems require unconventional solutions. And I believe my personal experience with rejection and adaptation has prepared me to understand perspectives that others might miss. Morrison leaned back in his chair, clearly intrigued despite his initial reservations. Explain what you mean by that, Miss Dalton. People who have been dismissed or discarded by society often develop insights that those in positions of comfort never acquire. Scarlett continued, warming to her theme as she saw the Colonel's genuine interest. I've spent my life learning to read situations and people because my survival depended on understanding things that weren't spoken aloud. Those same skills might prove valuable in negotiations where the stakes are life and death rather than just personal comfort. The conversation that followed revealed Morrison's sophisticated understanding of the political and military complexities facing Fort Laramie, as he outlined challenges that required not just linguistic translation, but cultural interpretation of the highest order. The Army needed people who could navigate between worldviews that were often fundamentally incompatible, who could find common ground in situations where none seemed to exist. We're not just fighting a war, Morrison explained, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who had seen too much unnecessary death. We're trying to prevent a complete breakdown of relations that could result in genocide on both sides. Every conversation with tribal representatives is a potential step toward either peace or total war, and the interpreters who facilitate those conversations carry responsibilities that most people couldn't handle. Morrison's evaluation of Scarlett's qualifications took an unexpected turn when a commotion erupted in the fort's main courtyard, drawing the attention of everyone in the administrative building to windows that looked out on a scene of barely controlled chaos. A delegation of Cheyenne leaders had arrived unexpectedly, their presence creating immediate tension among soldiers who had been trained to view all Indians as potential enemies regardless of their stated intentions. The timing of the delegation's arrival was clearly not coincidental, as Morrison's expression revealed when he observed the carefully orchestrated nature of what was unfolding outside his office. This was a test, either of Scarlett's claimed abilities or of the Army's willingness to honor its diplomatic commitments under pressure, and the outcome would determine whether the fragile peace negotiations of recent months would continue or collapse into renewed violence. Chief Iron Bear, Hanska identified quietly, naming the elderly Cheyenne leader whose presence commanded immediate respect from both his own people and the Army officers who had learned to recognize his authority. If he's here, it means something significant has happened. Iron Bear doesn't travel this far from his territory without important reasons. Morrison's decision to involve Scarlett in the impromptu diplomatic crisis demonstrated either remarkable confidence in Hanska's judgment or desperate recognition that conventional approaches had failed to produce satisfactory results in previous negotiations. Miss Dalton, he said, rising from his desk with military precision, it appears that your interview will be conducted under actual working conditions. Are you prepared to demonstrate your abilities in a situation where mistakes could have fatal consequences? The challenge was both opportunity and trap, as Scarlett understood immediately. Success would establish her credentials beyond any doubt, but failure would likely end not just her prospects for employment, but potentially her life, if diplomatic miscommunication led to violence. The stakes were higher than anything she had faced since leaving Cheyenne Station, but the alternative was returning to a world that offered her no place at all. I'm ready, Scarlett replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice as she committed herself to a course of action that would test every skill she had developed during her years of survival in hostile environments. What do you need me to do? The scene that unfolded in the fort's meeting hall revealed the complex dynamics of frontier diplomacy, where cultural misunderstandings could escalate into bloodshed within minutes if not carefully managed by people who understood the deeper currents of tribal politics and military necessity. Iron Bear's delegation had come to discuss rumors of Army patrols entering sacred Cheyenne territory. violations that threatened to undermine months of careful negotiation. Scarlet found herself thrust into the role of cultural translator, required not just to convey words from one language to another, but to bridge fundamental differences in worldview that made direct communication almost impossible. The Cheyenne leaders spoke of spiritual obligations and ancestral connections to land that Army officers viewed purely in terms of strategic value and territorial control. Chief Iron Bear says the spirits of his ancestors are angry, Scarlet translated, her voice carrying none of the skepticism that might have characterized less sensitive interpreters. He believes that the Army's presence in the Medicine Wheel Valley has disturbed sacred sites and brought bad medicine to his people. 3 children have died of fever since the patrols began, and the tribal council sees this as evidence of spiritual contamination. Morrison's response revealed his own evolution as a frontier commander, as he addressed Iron Bear's concerns with a respect that would have been unthinkable in earlier stages of the Indian Wars. "Tell the chief that the Army has no wish to disturb sacred places," he said carefully. "But we must also protect settlers from raiding parties that have been using the valley as a staging area for attacks on civilian targets." The negotiation that followed tested every diplomatic skill that Scarlet had developed through years of navigating hostile social environments, as she found herself mediating between worldviews that seemed to offer no common ground for agreement. The Army's need for territorial control conflicted directly with Cheyenne spiritual beliefs, while both sides operated under political pressures that made compromise appear to be weakness rather than wisdom. But Scarlet's unique perspective, as someone who had experienced rejection from multiple communities, allowed her to identify possibilities that others missed, connections between seemingly incompatible positions that could form the basis for mutually acceptable solutions. Her translation work evolved beyond mere linguistic conversion into genuine cultural interpretation that helped both sides understand not just what the other was saying, but why those words carried such emotional weight. "The chief is not just talking about military presence," Scarlet explained to Morrison during a brief recess in the formal negotiations. "He's describing a violation of the sacred order that his people believe maintains balance in the world. If we can find a way to acknowledge that spiritual dimension while addressing your security concerns, there might be room for compromise that neither side has considered." Morrison's willingness to explore unconventional approaches demonstrated the kind of adaptive thinking that had kept him alive through multiple frontier postings, as he authorized Scarlet to propose solutions that would have been dismissed as impossible by commanders who lacked his experience with the realities of Indian warfare. The proposal she developed during hurried consultations with both Hanska and Iron Bear's advisors represented a genuine innovation in frontier diplomacy. What if the Army established patrol routes that avoid the sacred sites while still providing security coverage for the settler communities? Scarlet suggested, outlining a plan that would require detailed coordination but offered benefits to both parties. Chief Iron Bear could provide guides who know which areas must remain untouched, while the Army gains access to intelligence about actual raiding party movements rather than chasing shadows through territory they don't understand. The complexity of implementing such an agreement would have daunted less experienced negotiators, but Scarlet's proposal offered something that both sides desperately needed: a face-saving solution that addressed core concerns without requiring either party to abandon fundamental principles. Morrison gained enhanced security for civilian settlements, while Iron Bear preserved the spiritual integrity of his people's sacred lands. The final breakthrough came when Scarlet identified a personal connection that transformed the entire dynamic of the negotiation as she discovered that Iron Bear's youngest daughter had been born with a deformed foot that marked her as different within Cheyenne society. The chief's understanding of what it meant to love someone whom others saw as flawed created a bond of empathy that transcended cultural barriers. "He says you have the heart of a warrior," Hanska translated as Iron Bear addressed Scarlet directly for the first time during the lengthy negotiation. Not because you fight with weapons, but because you fight for understanding between people who have forgotten how to see each other as human beings. The successful conclusion of the diplomatic crisis established Scarlett's reputation within Fort Laramie's command structure and beyond, as word of her innovative approach to cultural interpretation spread through military channels that connected frontier posts across the entire territorial system. Morrison's official report to his superiors included recommendations that would eventually influence policy at the highest levels of government. But for Scarlett personally, the most significant outcome was the recognition that she had found not just employment, but a calling that used her painful personal experiences to prevent suffering for others. The skills she had developed through years of surviving in hostile environments were not just tools for personal survival, but gifts that could bridge divides between peoples who had lost the ability to communicate across their differences. As evening fell over Fort Laramie, and the successful negotiation concluded with formal ceremonies that honored both military protocol and Cheyenne traditions, Scarlett found herself standing beside Hanska on the fort's walls, looking out over a landscape that no longer seemed alien, but had become the stage for work that gave her life meaning and purpose she had never imagined possible. "You did something remarkable today," Hanska said quietly, his voice carrying admiration mixed with something deeper that neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. "You turned your scars into bridges for people who had given up hope of understanding each other." Scarlett felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the dying sun painting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. As she realized that for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she belonged, doing work that only she could do, valued not despite her differences, but because of them. The broken merchandise that no man had wanted to purchase was becoming something far more valuable than any of those shallow buyers could have imagined, a bridge between worlds that desperately needed healing, a voice for understanding in a territory where violence had become the default language of communication between peoples who shared the same sky but could no longer see each other's humanity. 3 months into her tenure as Fort Laramie's primary cultural interpreter, Scarlett had transformed from an unwanted refugee into an indispensable asset, whose reputation extended far beyond the wooden walls of the military compound. Her innovative diplomatic methods had prevented 2 potential massacres and established communication protocols that were being studied by territorial administrators from Montana to Colorado. But success in frontier politics carried dangers that she was only beginning to understand. The letter arrived on a gray November morning when the first snow of winter painted the Wyoming landscape in deceptive beauty that masked the underlying harshness of survival in territory where political mistakes could cost entire communities their lives. Colonel Morrison's expression as he read the dispatch from territorial headquarters revealed the kind of tension that preceded either breakthrough or catastrophe in the delicate balance of frontier governance. "Washington is sending a special commission," Morrison announced during the emergency meeting he called with his senior staff and key civilian advisors, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of an officer who had learned to hide his personal opinions when delivering unwelcome news. Senator Bradley Hutchinson from Massachusetts, along with a team of Eastern experts who are going to investigate our Native American policies and recommend changes to the current treaty system. The implications of the commission's arrival struck everyone in the room like a physical blow, as they understood immediately that politicians who had never experienced frontier warfare were preparing to impose theoretical solutions on practical problems that required intimate knowledge of local conditions. Scarlett felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching winter, as she recognized the threat this represented to everything she had worked to build. Hanska's reaction was more direct and considerably more ominous as his years of experience with government commissions had taught him to expect the worst possible outcomes when Eastern politicians decided to reform Western policies. "How long do we have?" he asked, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone calculating survival odds in a deteriorating tactical situation. 6 weeks, Morrison replied grimly. They'll arrive just before Christmas, expecting full cooperation. With their investigation and complete access to all our diplomatic initiatives. Senator Hutchinson's preliminary communications suggest that he's particularly interested in our use of civilian interpreters in military negotiations. The meeting that followed revealed the complex political forces that were converging on Fort Laramie, with potentially devastating consequences for everyone involved in the fragile peace process that Scarlett had helped to establish. Eastern newspapers had been running stories about successful frontier diplomacy that made politicians hungry for dramatic reforms they could claim credit for during election campaigns. But beneath the surface of political opportunism lay deeper currents of racial prejudice and economic ambition that threatened to destroy years of careful relationship building between military authorities and tribal leaders who had finally begun to trust that some white officials could be relied upon to honor their commitments. The Commission's real agenda had less to do with improving Indian relations than with clearing the way for expanded railroad development and mining operations. News of the Commission's impending arrival spread through the network of scouts, traders, and tribal messengers that connected scattered communities across the Wyoming Territory, carrying implications that extended far beyond the walls of Fort Laramie into reservation councils and warrior societies that viewed any change in federal policy as a potential prelude to renewed warfare. The carefully constructed trust that had taken months to establish began showing signs of strain as old suspicions resurfaced among people who had learned through bitter experience that government promises rarely survive political transitions. Chief Iron Bear's urgent message arrived through channels that bypassed normal military communication protocols, delivered by his most trusted messenger to Hanska, personally rather than through official army channels that might compromise the sensitive nature of the information being shared. The aging Cheyenne leader's concerns reflected a sophisticated understanding of white politics that many frontier officials underestimated at their peril. Iron Bear says the young warriors are losing patience, Hanska translated as he shared the chief's message with Scarlett during one of their evening strategy sessions. They believe that the peace talks have been a trap designed to keep tribal forces divided, while the government prepares for a final campaign to eliminate Indian resistance entirely. The Commission's arrival is being interpreted as proof that Washington plans to abandon all current agreements. The intelligence that followed painted an increasingly dangerous picture of tribal politics throughout the region, as war leaders who had been marginalized during the recent peace initiatives began regaining influence among younger warriors who saw violence as the only remaining option for protecting their people's survival. The delicate coalition of moderate voices that had made negotiations possible was fracturing under pressure from extremists on both sides. Scarlett found herself caught between competing loyalties and conflicting responsibilities as she struggled to maintain the diplomatic channels that represented the only alternative to a bloodbath that would consume innocent civilians, along with the military and tribal forces preparing for renewed conflict. Her unique position as a bridge between cultures made her simultaneously invaluable and extremely vulnerable as political tensions escalated. There's something else, Hanska continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper as he shared intelligence that could get them both killed if it reached the wrong ears. Iron Bear believes there's a faction within the territorial government that wants the peace process to fail. They're deliberately trying to provoke incidents that will justify military action against tribes that have been cooperating with federal authorities. The conspiracy that Hanska described involved powerful business interests who saw continued Indian resistance as an obstacle to profitable development of mineral resources and transportation networks that required complete control of tribal territories. These forces had sufficient political influence to manipulate federal policy through carefully orchestrated campaigns of misinformation and manufactured crises. The realization that they were facing not just political opposition, but active sabotage by forces with unlimited resources and complete ruthlessness transformed Scarlett's understanding of the stakes involved in her work. This was not merely a difference of opinion about policy approaches, but a calculated attempt to destroy everything she had worked to build, while eliminating anyone who stood in the way of economic exploitation, disguised as manifest destiny. As winter tightened its grip on the Wyoming territory, and the Commission's arrival drew closer, Scarlett found herself grappling with personal emotions that complicated her professional responsibilities in ways she had never anticipated. Her partnership with Hanska had evolved beyond mere collaboration into something deeper and more complex that defied easy categorization, creating vulnerabilities that their enemies could exploit if they understood the true nature of the bond that had developed between the unwanted woman and the exiled warrior. The recognition of her feelings came during a particularly difficult negotiation session when Hanska had been forced to enter dangerous territory to meet with tribal leaders who refused to come to the fort, leaving Scarlett to wonder if she would ever see him again. The intensity of her fear for his safety revealed emotions that she had been carefully avoiding acknowledging, feelings that had no place in the professional relationship they had maintained, despite the intimacy created by shared dangers and mutual dependence. "You care about him," observed Dr. Sarah Martinez, the fort's newly arrived physician whose own unconventional position as one of the Army's few female medical officers had created a natural alliance with Scarlett based on their shared experience of fighting for acceptance in male-dominated environments. "More than you want to admit, even to yourself." Scarlett's immediate instinct was to deny the observation, but Dr. Martinez's direct approach and obvious good intentions made deception seem both pointless and potentially harmful to her own emotional well-being. The conversation that followed took place in the privacy of the medical facility, where patient confidentiality provided cover for discussions that could not safely occur in more public venues. "It's not that simple," Scarlett replied, her voice carrying the frustration of someone trying to navigate emotional territory for which her survival-focused upbringing had provided no useful preparation. "Even if I wanted to pursue such feelings, the social barriers are insurmountable. A relationship between us would destroy both our professional effectiveness and probably get us both killed by people who see it as an abomination." Dr. Martinez's response revealed her own sophisticated understanding of frontier social dynamics and the particular challenges facing women who dared to step outside conventional roles in societies that punish deviation from accepted norms with systematic exclusion or outright violence. "The question isn't what society will accept," she said gently. "The question is what you can live with if you let fear make your personal decisions for you." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of urgent news that transformed personal concerns into immediate survival issues, as reports reached the fort of a coordinated attack on 3 separate settler communities that appeared designed to provoke the kind of military response that would justify abandoning all current peace initiatives. The timing of the attacks, coming just weeks before the Commission's arrival, suggested the kind of strategic planning that pointed toward the conspiracy Hanska had warned about. Morrison's emergency briefing revealed the scope of the crisis that was engulfing the entire territorial command structure, as similar attacks were reported across a front that stretched from Colorado to Montana. The coordination required for such operations indicated planning and resources that exceeded the capabilities of any single tribal confederation, suggesting external support from forces that benefited from continued conflict. "This is exactly what they wanted," Scarlett realized as she studied the pattern of attacks on Morrison's situation map. "Maximum civilian casualties in locations that will generate newspaper headlines back east, perfectly timed to arrive just as the Commission begins its investigation. Someone is orchestrating a campaign designed to make peaceful coexistence appear impossible." The crisis that followed the coordinated attacks forced Scarlett into the most difficult decision of her career, as she was faced with choosing between her professional responsibilities and her personal convictions about right and wrong. Colonel Morrison, under intense pressure from territorial headquarters to demonstrate decisive military action, was being ordered to suspend all diplomatic initiatives and begin offensive operations against tribal communities regardless of their actual involvement in the recent violence. The orders from Territorial Command represented exactly the kind of indiscriminate military response that would destroy years of careful relationship building, while providing justification for the business interests that had orchestrated the crisis in the first place. Morrison's position was impossible, caught between military discipline that required obedience to superior officers and his professional judgment that the proposed operations would result in unnecessary casualties while failing to address the actual sources of the violence. They want me to arrest Iron Bear and the other tribal leaders who have been working with us, Morrison explained during a private meeting with his most trusted advisors, his voice carrying the strain of an officer being forced to betray people who had trusted him with their lives. The territorial governor believes that negotiating with Indians has made us appear weak, and that only overwhelming force will restore respect for federal authority. Scarlett's response to this development revealed the transformation she had undergone since arriving at Fort Laramie as unwanted merchandise, as she demonstrated the kind of moral courage that her experiences with rejection and survival had forged into an unshakable commitment to protecting the innocent regardless of personal cost. Colonel, if we arrest the moderate leaders who have been working for peace, we'll be handing control of tribal politics to the war faction that has been arguing all along that whites cannot be trusted. The strategic implications of the proposed arrests extended far beyond immediate military considerations into the realm of long-term territorial stability, as the destruction of the moderate coalition would eliminate any possibility of negotiated solutions to conflicts that would otherwise require years of bloody warfare to resolve. Scarlett understood better than anyone how fragile the trust was that had made recent diplomatic successes possible, but her opposition to the military's new direction carried personal risks that went beyond professional disagreement into the territory of treason charges that could result in court-martial and execution for anyone who actively interfered with federal military operations. The Commission's arrival had created an atmosphere of paranoia where any deviation from official policy was viewed as potential collaboration with enemy forces. The news that Hanska had been captured during a reconnaissance mission behind tribal lines transformed Scarlett's abstract concerns about policy into immediate fears for the life of the man whose partnership had become the foundation of everything meaningful in her existence. The circumstances of his capture suggested that he had been betrayed by someone with access to detailed information about his movements and mission objectives. They're holding him at the territorial prison in Cheyenne, Dr. Martinez reported, after using her medical connections to gather intelligence about Hanska's situation. The charges include espionage, treason, and conspiracy to incite Indian uprising. Under current military law, he could face execution within days if someone doesn't intervene on his behalf. The impossible choice that Scarlett faced required her to decide between personal loyalty and professional survival, between the safe path of accepting injustice and the dangerous course of fighting for what she knew to be right. Everything she had built at Fort Laramie, all the progress toward peaceful coexistence that had given her life meaning and purpose, hung in the balance of decisions that would determine not just Hanska's fate, but the direction of territorial policy for years to come. I have to try to save him, Scarlett said finally, her voice carrying the quiet determination of someone who had found something worth fighting for, despite the enormous personal cost that such a fight would inevitably exact. Even if it means losing everything else I've worked for, I can't let them destroy the only person who saw value in what everyone else considered worthless. The plan that emerged from desperate consultation between Scarlett, Dr. Martinez, and a small group of fort personnel who had come to understand that their survival depended on maintaining the fragile peace that official policy was now threatening to destroy, represented the kind of calculated risk that desperate times demanded from people who refused to accept inevitable tragedy. As Scarlett prepared to leave Fort Laramie on a mission that would either save the man she had come to love or destroy them both in the attempt, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from the auction block in Cheyenne Station to this moment of ultimate testing. The broken woman whom no one had wanted was preparing to risk everything for principles that had been forged in the crucible of shared suffering and mutual respect. The commission would arrive to find a situation far more complex than their political theories had prepared them to understand, as the woman they would dismiss as an unimportant civilian prepared to demonstrate that sometimes the most powerful force for change comes from those whom society has written off as worthless, but who refuse to accept that judgment as final. Winter storms were gathering over the Wyoming Territory, but the real tempest was just beginning as forces beyond anyone's control prepared to collide in ways that would reshape the frontier forever. The territorial prison in Cheyenne stood like a monument to institutional cruelty, its stone walls and iron bars designed not merely to contain, but to break the spirits of those deemed enemies of civilized progress. Scarlett approached the fortress under cover of a December blizzard that provided both concealment and deadly risk, her plan depending on timing so precise that a single miscalculation would result in capture, torture, and execution for herself. While condemning Hanska to the gallows that awaited him at dawn, the intelligence network that Dr. Martinez had cultivated among medical personnel throughout the territory had provided crucial details about the prison's layout and guard rotations. Information purchased with gold coins and promises of future favors that represented the kind of shadowy transactions necessary for survival when official channels had been corrupted by political ambition and business interests that profited from perpetual warfare. Scarlett's infiltration of the prison complex required skills she had never imagined possessing, as she used her intimate knowledge of human psychology and her hard-earned understanding of institutional blind spots to navigate security measures designed to prevent exactly the kind of rescue operation she was attempting. Her withered arm, which had marked her as worthless in the eyes of those who measured human value by physical perfection, became an asset that guards dismissed as making her harmless. The disguise she wore was that of a territorial health inspector, complete with forged documents that would not withstand close scrutiny but might provide enough official appearance to gain access during the confusion of a shift change, complicated by the howling blizzard that had transformed Cheyenne into a landscape of blinding snow and deadly cold. Her medical bag contained not just the tools of healing but instruments of liberation that could mean the difference between rescue and disaster. Papers, demanded Guard Captain Wesley Brooks, a brutal man whose reputation for cruelty toward prisoners had made him valuable to administrators who wanted information extracted through methods that left no official documentation. His scarred hands and cold eyes spoke of someone who enjoyed inflicting pain on those who could not fight back, making him exactly the kind of person who would underestimate a woman with visible disabilities. Scarlett's performance as a harried medical official concerned about disease outbreaks among the prisoner population drew on every survival skill she had developed during years of manipulating hostile authority figures who held power over her fate. She complained about the weather, worried about infectious diseases spreading from the overcrowded cells, and demanded immediate access to conduct health inspections that could not be delayed without risking epidemic conditions. The combination of official paperwork, medical terminology, and bureaucratic urgency created exactly the kind of confusion that institutional functionaries feared most. As Brooks found himself caught between competing directives that seemed to require contradictory responses, allow the inspection and risk criticism for security lapses, or refuse and face blame if disease outbreaks resulted from delayed medical intervention. Hanska's cell occupied the darkest corner of the prison's maximum security section, where political prisoners awaited trials that were formalities preceding predetermined executions designed to send messages to anyone who might challenge federal authority in the territories. The conditions were calculated to break both body and spirit. With inadequate food, no heat, and isolation that drove many prisoners insane long before they faced the gallows. But Scarlet found not a broken man awaiting death, but a warrior who had used his imprisonment to prepare for whatever opportunities might arise. His time in captivity spent planning rather than despairing. The reunion between them took place in whispered Lakota phrases that guards could not understand, words that conveyed not just escape plans, but emotions that had been carefully suppressed until this moment of ultimate crisis brought truth to the surface. "I knew you would come," Hanska said in English quiet enough to avoid detection, his voice carrying certainty rather than hope. "Not because I expected rescue, but because I finally understood what kind of person you really are. Someone who fights for others, even when the cost exceeds any rational calculation of benefit." The escape plan that Scarlet had devised required splitting up immediately upon leaving the prison, with each taking different routes toward a rendezvous point where Dr. Martinez waited with horses and supplies for a journey that would carry them beyond the reach of territorial authorities. But Hanska's information about the conspiracy behind recent attacks changed everything, as he revealed intelligence that could prevent a massacre, but only if they returned to Fort Laramie instead of fleeing to safety. "Senator Hutchinson is not what he appears to be," Hanska explained as they moved through corridors that Scarlet's reconnaissance had identified as temporarily unguarded. "He's part of the railroad syndicate that's been orchestrating the attacks, and his commission is designed to provide legal justification for seizing all remaining tribal lands under emergency military authority. Iron Bear's people are walking into a trap that will be sprung the moment the senator signs his report." The revelation transformed their escape from a simple rescue operation into a race against time that would determine the fate of thousands of innocent people caught between competing forces that saw human life as expendable in pursuit of political and economic objectives. Scarlet understood that returning to Fort Laramie would mean certain capture and execution, but allowing the conspiracy to succeed would result in atrocities that would haunt her for whatever brief time remained of her life. The choice between personal survival and moral responsibility represented the ultimate test of the transformation she had undergone since being rejected as worthless merchandise at the Cheyenne Station auction. The woman who had once been discarded as broken was preparing to sacrifice everything to prevent the breaking of an entire people who had trusted her with their hopes for peaceful coexistence. "We go back," Scarlet decided, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had finally discovered her true purpose in life. "Whatever happens to us, we cannot let thousands of innocent people die because we chose safety over justice." The journey back to Fort Laramie, through the blizzard that raged across the Wyoming territory, tested every survival skill they possessed, as Scarlet and Hanska pushed themselves and their horses beyond normal endurance limits in a desperate attempt to reach the fort before Senator Hutchinson's commission could complete its predetermined findings and authorize the military operations that would destroy the fragile peace they had worked so hard to build. But their arrival at Fort Laramie revealed a situation far worse than either had imagined, as they discovered that Colonel Morrison had been relieved of command and replaced by Colonel Marcus Blackwood, a career officer whose reputation for brutality toward Indian populations had made him the perfect choice for implementing the new aggressive policies that the commission was preparing to authorize. The fort itself had been transformed into a staging area for offensive operations that would begin the moment legal justification could be established. Scarlet's plan for exposing the conspiracy required gaining access to the commission's private meetings where the real decisions were being made, but her status as a fugitive made direct approach impossible while the increased Security around the commission members eliminated most conventional infiltration options. The solution she devised drew on her understanding of institutional psychology and the particular blindness that afflicted powerful men when dealing with women they considered beneath their notice. "I'm going to walk directly into their meeting," Scarlett explained to Hanska, as they observed the commission's headquarters from concealment in the abandoned sutler store that had been closed since military operations began. Not as a fugitive or a spy, but as exactly what they expect to see: a broken woman seeking mercy from her betters. The performance that followed represented the culmination of every survival skill Scarlett had developed during her years of navigating hostile environments where showing weakness was often the only way to avoid destruction. She presented herself to the commission guards as a destitute woman seeking work as a domestic servant, someone so obviously harmless and desperate that she posed no conceivable threat to important men conducting important business. Her appearance in the commission's private meeting room during their final deliberations created exactly the kind of disruption she had calculated, as the powerful men found themselves forced to deal with an interruption that their security arrangements had not anticipated. Senator Hutchinson's reaction revealed both his arrogance and his complete underestimation of the woman who stood before him with her head bowed in apparent submission. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" Hutchinson demanded, his voice carrying the imperial authority of someone accustomed to absolute deference from those he considered his social inferiors. "Remove this woman immediately and find out how she gained access to a secure facility." But Scarlett's response transformed the dynamic of the encounter in ways that caught everyone in the room completely off guard, as she straightened her shoulders and spoke with the voice of someone who had finally found her true power. "Senator, I believe you should hear what I have to say before you sign a report that will authorize genocide in the name of American progress." The confrontation that followed exposed the full scope of the conspiracy that had manipulated federal policy for the benefit of business interests that viewed human life as a commodity to be exploited for profit. Scarlett's testimony, delivered with the precision of someone who had spent months documenting evidence, and the passion of someone who had seen the human cost of political corruption, revealed connections between the railroad syndicate and government officials that reached to the highest levels of territorial administration. Senator Hutchinson's initial attempt to dismiss her accusations crumbled when Scarlett produced documented evidence of financial transactions, forged military reports, and coordinated attacks that could only have been organized by people with access to classified information and unlimited funding. The documents she had gathered during her months at Fort Laramie, combined with intelligence provided by tribal sources, painted a picture of systematic manipulation that implicated dozens of powerful individuals. "You have no idea what forces you're challenging," Hutchinson warned, his voice losing its political polish as he revealed the genuine menace that lay beneath his civilized exterior. "The expansion of American civilization requires difficult decisions that weak minds cannot comprehend. Sometimes progress demands sacrifices from those too primitive to understand their role in the greater destiny of our nation." Scarlett's response to his threats drew on every painful experience of rejection and survival that had shaped her character as she stood before the most powerful men in the territory and refused to be intimidated by authority that derived its legitimacy from the systematic oppression of those society deemed worthless. "Senator, I spent my entire life being told that I was worthless because I didn't meet other people's standards of perfection. But I learned something that you will never understand. True strength comes not from the power to destroy others, but from the courage to protect those who cannot protect themselves." The commission meeting dissolved into chaos as other members began to distance themselves from Hutchinson's increasingly extreme positions, their political instincts warning them that association with his agenda would destroy their careers if the evidence Scarlett had presented became public knowledge. The careful facade of legal authority began cracking under the pressure of truth spoken by someone who had nothing left to lose. But the real transformation occurred when Colonel Morrison, accompanied by a company of soldiers loyal to him, rather than to the corrupt command structure that had tried to replace him, arrived to place Senator Hutchinson and his co-conspirators under arrest for treason, fraud, and conspiracy to commit genocide. The colonel's return had been made possible by Scarlett's evidence, reaching sympathetic officials in Washington who understood that territorial corruption threatened federal authority more than Indian resistance ever could. Miss Dalton, Morrison said formally as military personnel took the conspirators into custody, "Your service to this territory and to the cause of justice will not be forgotten. You have prevented a tragedy that would have stained American honor for generations." The aftermath of the Commission's exposure brought changes that extended far beyond Fort Laramie into the broader realm of federal Indian policy, as Washington officials recognized that peaceful coexistence required different approaches than those that had characterized previous decades of frontier expansion. Scarlett's innovative diplomatic methods became the foundation for new protocols that emphasized cultural understanding over military dominance. 6 months after the Commission crisis, Fort Laramie had been transformed from a military outpost, preparing for war, into a center for diplomatic innovation that attracted visitors from across the nation and beyond. Scarlett's work as chief cultural liaison had established new standards for intercultural communication that were being studied and replicated throughout the American frontier and in international colonial administrations facing similar challenges. The wedding ceremony that united Scarlett Dalton and Hanska Blackfeather took place according to both Christian and Lakota traditions, symbolizing the kind of cultural synthesis that their partnership had made possible in the broader realm of territorial politics. Chief Iron Bear himself conducted the Native American portions of the ceremony, while Dr. Martinez served as maid of honor in a celebration that would have been unthinkable under the social conditions that had existed just months earlier. "You have both traveled far from the places where your journeys began," Iron Bear observed during his ceremonial address, his words carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed the transformation of two individuals and the broader transformation of relationships between their peoples, from rejection to acceptance, from exile to belonging, from despair to hope. "Your union represents the possibility that all our children might find such healing." The community that gathered to witness their marriage included representatives from tribes that had been enemies for generations, military officers who had learned to see Native Americans as allies rather than obstacles, and civilian settlers who had discovered that cooperation produced better results than conflict. The celebration represented not just personal happiness, but a demonstration of social possibilities that few had believed achievable. Scarlett's reflection on the journey that had brought her from the auction block to this moment of complete acceptance and love revealed the profound transformation that occurred when society's rejects refused to accept the limitations imposed by others' prejudices and fears. "I was called flawed, broken, worthless by people who measured human value by standards that had nothing to do with character, intelligence, or the capacity for love," she said during her wedding vows. But Hanska saw something different, and through his eyes I learned to see myself as I truly was. Not damaged goods, but a person capable of building bridges between worlds that had forgotten how to communicate. The work that continued to flow from their partnership extended beyond immediate territorial concerns into the realm of federal policy, as their success in preventing warfare while protecting both settler and tribal interests attracted attention. From government officials seeking alternatives to the costly military campaigns that had characterized previous approaches to frontier expansion. Their methods were being adapted for use in conflicts involving other marginalized populations throughout the American territories. But perhaps the most significant outcome of their story was its demonstration that society's discards often possessed exactly the qualities needed to solve problems that conventional approaches could not address. Scarlett's experience with rejection had given her unique insights into the psychology of marginalized peoples, while Hanska's exile from his tribe had provided him with the cultural flexibility necessary for building bridges between incompatible worldviews. 5 years later, when historians attempted to document the transformation of Wyoming Territory from a battleground of perpetual warfare into a model of peaceful coexistence, they would struggle to explain how such dramatic change had emerged from what appeared to be an insignificant transaction at a third-rate auction in an obscure frontier town. The official records would note the innovative diplomatic protocols, the successful prevention of genocidal military campaigns, and the establishment of cultural institutions that provided alternatives to violence in resolving interethnic conflicts. But the deeper truth was simpler and more profound than any bureaucratic analysis could capture. Sometimes the most beautiful transformations begin with the simplest recognition that every human being possesses inherent worth that transcends the arbitrary judgments of societies too limited in their vision to see the potential that exists within their own discards. The woman they called Flawed had become the foundation for healing that extended far beyond her individual circumstances into the broader realm of human possibility. The auction block in Cheyenne Station had been dismantled years earlier. Its lumber used to build a school where children of all backgrounds learned together under teachers who understood that education meant helping each student discover their unique gifts rather than forcing them to conform to narrow expectations. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind carried memories across the Wyoming plains, people would remember the day when $20 had purchased not a broken woman but the beginning of a new world where being different was not a flaw to be hidden but a strength to be celebrated. The story of Scarlett Dalton and Hanska Blackfeather had become legend, but its true power lay not in the extraordinary nature of their achievements, but in its demonstration that extraordinary outcomes could emerge from the most ordinary acts of human kindness and recognition. In a world that seemed determined to break anyone who dared to be different, they had proven that love and understanding could transform even the most hopeless circumstances into foundations for building better futures. And in the end, that was the most beautiful thing of all, not that they had escaped the cruel judgment of their societies, but that they had created something new and better from the ashes of those judgments, something that would continue growing long after their individual stories had ended, something that proved that the human spirit was stronger than any force that tried to break it.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.